And now it's time for Answers with Eric from Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. All right, everybody, it is so good to be back with you. Today we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, the beginning of a story that's going to continue next time. And in this passage, we will see an important family relationship that really brings some possibilities to the passage, and we're also going to consider what God requires of those that he wishes to save. So, question number one, as we get right to it, what two events happened at, quote, about the same time? And also a cross-reference here for chapter 11, verse number 30. And from this verse, verse number 1, we see that Herod began persecuting the church, and that was the kind of the second fact. So here's the second thing that happened. But as you look back at chapter 11, verse 30, the thing that had happened about that time was really kind of connected with Abagus the prophet, the famine that was predicted, and Saul and Barnabas then are the ones who are sent with money to Jerusalem. So here are the two things. Really kind of in chronological order. Barnabas and Saul had been sent with money to Jerusalem, and then at about that same time, Herod began persecuting the church. And we continue to question number 2. What happened to James? As it indicates here, he was put to death with a sword. And what else do you know about him? And yeah, you might have a lot of different things here, but the reason I asked is I wanted to see if what came to mind for you is what came to mind for me, is that in Matthew chapter 20, verses 22 and 23, Jesus had predicted the martyrdom of James. So that chapter 12, verse 2, you see that James is actually put to death by the sword. Well, Jesus warned him that he would, in fact, drink the cup that he drank of, that he would die just as Jesus died. And I did put that note in here that it's kind of strange. You might think that Herod, the king of the Jews, would actually be able to execute somebody, put somebody to death, because they couldn't do that with Jesus. But now this is a new king in town. This is Herod, and he has more favor with Rome, and Rome grants him permission to put people to death. So that's why there's that instance there that he is able to put people to death. They've granted him that power. Question for verse 3, it says, how did the Jews respond? And the verse says, in verse 3, it says they were pleased. And what did Herod do next? Well, Herod arrested people according to this verse. And a thought question, had Peter been arrested before? And the cross references for Acts chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. And when you go back there and look, you can see, yes, he had been arrested before, he and the other disciples, and they had been actually freed by an angel. On to question 4. How many soldiers guarded him? And the answer is 16. So for some reason in my mind, I hadn't made this connection that a squad, as some translations have it, a squad of soldiers would actually be 4. A squad is 4. Think of quad. And so there were 4 squads, and that makes 16 soldiers guarding this one man. So Herod he's aware of what happened earlier, perhaps. He knows that the apostles had escaped the imprisonment at one time before. He's not going to let that happen. He put 16 soldiers in charge of watching over this one man. Good luck with that, Herod. Let's see what happens. Okay, and on to a question for verse 5. It says, what was happening while Peter was in the prison? And this verse is a lovely verse. And it talks about the church praying fervently for him. And it's that very night. Peter's already asleep. Verse number 5, it says, while Peter was kept in prison, but prayer was being made fervently by the church of God. God's church cares about Peter. They're praying for him. And we're going to find out late into the night, and then they're there all night praying, which makes sense actually, because it's the Passover. So they should be having a Passover meal at the same time. Let me see what verse it indicates that it was the Passover. Verse 3 says, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. It was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. And then verse 6 indicates, on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward. So they're celebrating the Passover. The very next day, the Passover is done, and so Herod feels like he can go move on to other things now that the Passover is finished, and he's going to put Peter to death. But that very night, they're celebrating the Passover, remembering the Passover, remembering their deliverance from Egypt, and a little illusion there. They're thinking about a deliverance, and look what's going to happen as they pray. So on to question 6. For verse 6, it says, what did Peter do the night before his impending death? I just read that a little bit. He was sleeping. All right, so think about it. You know you're going to die. You know that you're about to be hung, your head, a noose around your neck, a sword taken to you, cut off your head. The next day is the day that you're going to be put to death. I wouldn't be sleeping. I don't think any of us would be sleeping. There's no way we would be sleeping, but somehow Peter is very calm. He's able to go to sleep. I think it's an indication of his faith. Wonderful faith Peter had. He knew that the Lord would deliver him. Somehow he wasn't worried, and even if he did die, maybe he was just at such peace with it, he was just able to sleep that night. So he was asleep. In this verse, second part of this question, in this verse, how much hope is given for his escape? So as you think about how it is described, this scenario where Peter is in prison, all of the soldiers, then it indicates here that he's between 2 soldiers, and he's bound with 2 chains, and there are guards watching over the prison, watching over the doors. Herod has made sure that this guy is not going to escape. There's not much hope for his escape, according to this verse. But let's move on to verse 7. Who appeared? An angel of the Lord. And how did he wake Peter? And here it's an interesting language, because the language is going to be used later on in the chapter of being struck. Here the angel struck Peter's side. Kind of a kick. I don't know. It hits him. Wake up, struck his side. And what happens to the chains then? The chains just fall off of his hands. Question for verse 8, it says, what did the angel basically tell Peter to do? He was basically saying, put on your clothes, get your shoes on, and follow me. We're getting out of here. All right, so that's what he tells him to do. Verse number 9, the question is, did Peter obey? And yes, he obeyed. He got his cloak on. In verse number 9, it's very clear. And he went out and continued to follow, but he didn't know what was being done by the angel, that it was real. He thought he was seeing a vision. So what was he thinking? He thought he was seeing a vision. And question for 10 says, where does the angel leave Peter? So the angel guides him all this way out, and the gates open. They walk right by guards. The guards are completely unaware. And when they get out to the street and have walked down the street a little ways, it seems, then all of a sudden the angel disappears. So he leaves Peter right on the street. And verse number 11, question says, what happened to Peter? And here the part that I was really keying in on is he came to himself. Very much like the language of when nowadays when somebody gets knocked out and he wakes up, we say, yeah, he's coming to. He came to. Maybe that language is specifically from Scripture, just been around a long time, I don't know, but he came to. And here it's just kind of like an awareness came to him. I'm awake. He came to himself. He was aware. He was conscious of his surroundings. He was conscious of the fact that he was there on the street and no longer in jail, and that it was real, not a dream. He came to himself. Question for 12. Question is, who is introduced in verse number 12? Now, this is a neat verse for me. Mary, who was the mother of John Mark. So Mark, who was, I think, what did it say? Mark, who was also called John. Oh, what verse is this? Last verse, verse number 12. He went to the house of Mary, so obviously this is somebody who's well known as being a church leader, and it's the mother of John, who was also called Mark. John, who was also called Mark. Now, if that name, John Mark, if that name's familiar to you, this is a very important character. Mary is the mother. This is John Mark's mother's house. I don't know if John Mark is there or not, but it says where many were gathered together and were praying. Now, John Mark happens to be the cousin of Barnabas. And this information is found in Colossians 4:10. And you probably have to take a lot of other references to make it definitive, but it is definitive that John Mark is the cousin of Barnabas. And Colossians 4:10 is the verse that you would want to look at to start there, to put a bunch of pieces together. But it's interesting because now, well, let me ask the next question. Who was introduced? It was Mary. And also John Mark is introduced, though we don't know necessarily he's at the house. And what was happening at Mary's house, and that's the fact that many believers were gathered together and were praying. They were in the fervent prayer in the house. I don't know if this is going to be more important than a Bible study or not. What do you think? Let's see who it is. Maybe it's one of you calling. I don't know. Oh, it's my brother Jay. I've got to pause, and I'm going to come right back to you guys just in a sec. And now we're back. And after pausing for a moment to speak with our lovely brother and sister Jay and Charity Noble, I realized that you guys are having to put up with this glare that's on my head, and I should have done this a little while ago. How's that? You like that? All right, so now back to where we were. All right, so we were discussing, we're at the house of Mary, and the church is gathered there, and they're praying through late into the night, at least. If not, they're not planning on, I would assume they're planning on being there all night, because it's the Passover, and on the Passover they were up all night waiting to leave the next day. So a lot of believers were there praying, and the thing I would want to ask you is, since now you know that this is Mary, who is an aunt apparently to Barnabas, and we also knew from the end of chapter 11 that Barnabas and Saul had gone to Jerusalem to deliver money to the church there on behalf of the church in Antioch. Is it possible? Well, it is possible. It's very possible. I don't know how likely, but it's very possible that when Peter arrives, well, we know he's headed to this house. We don't know if he's going to arrive there or not yet, do we? But I hope you keep reading. But will he actually meet up with Barnabas and Saul? Because if Barnabas is coming to town, who's he going to stay with? His closest relative, probably his aunt. And we know that Barnabas has an affinity for his cousin John Mark. He's very close with the family. It seems like Mary, we know that Barnabas was very wealthy. That was back in chapter 5, or at the end of chapter 4, when he gave a large, so he sold some property and gave it. And let me double check those numbers here for you, since I'm blabbing about it. Now, chapter 4, verse number 36, now Joseph, a Levite of Cyprian birth, who was also called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means son of encouragement, and who owned a tract of land, sold it, and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. And it was probably an impressive sum of money that he brought. He might come from a wealthy Levite family, and his aunt might be a part of that wealthy Levite family. That's why everybody has come to her house to pray, because she's got a large house. And we're also going to learn later that she has a servant who is serving, and everybody else is in the inner part of the house. It's a large house. She has servants. She's very well to do. So if Barnabas comes into town and he's got a friend with him named Saul, very likely they're there. It's possible. So it makes it interesting in the reading here. All right, now more for thought, because that's the end of the verses, end of the discussion for there. And I hope if you have questions or other comments, you'll leave them down below in the comments section. But for right now, think about this. In the escape, what did the angel do and what did Peter do? What lesson can we learn? And so just a simple thought here that really the angel did all the important work, right? The angel's the one who orchestrates everything, gets Peter up, walks him out undetected. The gates swing open. It's an amazing miracle. It's a wonderful work of God. But Peter still had to obey and do what was required. He had to get all of his clothes on, to get his shoes on and follow. He had to gird himself up and be ready to go. So he did that, and he obeyed, but he had to do that to be saved. And we learn that God can do wonderful things for us, but we're still required to live and act according to all that he requires of us. He will save us, but we still must obey and follow him. That's what the angel said, follow me. And Peter was willing to do that. He followed him. Another forethought question, 2 forethought questions in this section here. This question is, how does this Passover, and as we highlighted in verse number 4, it was the Passover. He was to be executed the day after the Passover. How does this Passover compare with the original? And I had a cross-reference here for you to go back and look specifically at just a couple of verses, and there's more to it than this, but just looking at these few verses. Exodus chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, and then in verse 17. And this is what I thought would just be a very, very simple comparison, is that Peter, well, back at the original Passover, they were to be clothed, have their shoes on, be ready to go, even in the night. This feast was going to last. They were to do it all night, and it was in the middle of the night that God came through. If they had put the blood over the doorpost and across on the lintel, then they would be saved, and they'd be ready to go the next day. And just as Israel was delivered, Peter was also delivered. So the idea of being clothed, being ready to go, being girded, actually the language even I think is specific in both of those. Peter was told to gird himself, and that's what the Israelites were told back in Exodus, gird yourselves and have your sandals on your feet, ready to go. And that's what Peter was told. Some very, very clear allusions to the Exodus here. And Peter was delivered just as the Israelites were delivered. So that's the lesson. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you're anxious to get the final result. What's going to happen next. Peter has come to the house of Mary, and what's going to happen. More on that next time. God bless you, and may the Lord make his face shine upon you.